So when you are considering a relationship, what are the kinds of things you go through? Well, you recognize that there are going to be expectations that the other person has of you. There are going to be expectations that you have for the other person. There can be and will be misunderstandings. And so there really is something that has to be larger. There has to be a bigger draw to say that I want to be willing to set myself out there to go through the bumps of whatever is going to happen in this relationship, regardless of whatever issues, whatever that is like. I mean, certainly if you're talking about marriage, that's one thing. If you're talking about family members in general, that's another thing. If you're talking about school, that's one thing. If you're talking about workplace, well, that's different, even down to if it's a co-worker, if it's a person you're supervising or a person that's supervising you, all these ways in which the conversations are different, the relationship is different, and you make those decisions regarding those in how you work it out. So we have this story of Ruth, and it begins with the woman Naomi. Naomi has a husband, his name is Elimelech, and it seems that there's a famine in the land of Israel. So as significant as this move was to go to another country, they decide that eating is most important, and so they go to the land of Moab and find food there, recognizing that they have two sons and that it's very likely that these two sons then would marry Moabite women. And you're just coming off of the history where the people have garnered the promised land, and they have this very clearly in their minds that God feels keenly. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. That's how it starts out. That's the foundation. And it's why they kicked out all the Canaanites, and they were supposed to kick out any kind of gods associated with them. It was very clear. Do not intermarry with people who follow other gods. Well, that's going to happen, and indeed it does. Well, as soon as they get there, basically, Elimelech dies. That's not good, but at least Naomi has a couple of sons, and she can find her way forward through them. They do indeed marry Moabite women, but of all things, in a short period of time, both of these men die as well. So now you have three widows. And in that time and place, there was no recourse for widows, essentially, that you were destined for a life of poverty. The ability to get food and clothing and shelter was always through a man. So now what are they going to do? Orpah is the name of one of the daughters-in-law, and when Naomi decides that she's going to go back to Israel, that there's now food back there and at least some family maybe to help out, Orpah eventually says, okay, I'll stay behind. That Naomi's encouraging. Naomi also encourages Ruth to follow her sister-in-law and do likewise, saying, you two are young, you can get remarried, you can have a great life. Don't saddle yourself with whatever my future is going to look like here, because certainly you will be almost inevitably signing yourself up for a life of poverty. Ruth says no. She's adamant. I am going with you. And you have these incredible words of commitment. Your God shall be my God. Your people shall be my people. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Not even death will part us. Big stuff. And that's what we oftentimes use in wedding ceremonies. Curiously enough, that this is a relationship between a woman and her mother-in-law, but this is the kind of commitment that we're looking for, that we see as really godly, that drives what makes a relationship true love as apart to anything else. So they end up in Israel. And there are going to be a couple of key pieces from Hebrew culture that give a way forward. One of those is that at least if you're a farmer, if you're a landowner, it's understood that you will leave a little bit of your grain after you harvest so that the widows can come and do what they call gleaning, can have some grain. At least they have something to eat. And so Ruth is the younger one, and Naomi, she has a plan, even though no one's aware of it yet at this point in time. So she kind of pushes Ruth to go in a certain direction and get her gleaning done in this farm. And so she does. She comes back with a good amount of grain, and Naomi says, well, how'd it go? And Ruth says, well, it went very well. It is a dangerous world, always has been, particularly for women. You might get accosted, harassed, whatever, and they were just lovely people, and they gave me a good amount of grain, and so I think I'll go back there again. And Naomi goes, I think that's a good idea. And oh, by the way, what was the farm? Who owns it that you went to? And she goes, well, it was Boaz. And Naomi just kind of goes, oh, okay. That sounds good. You just keep going there. All right. So Ruth does. And now this is all in Naomi's scheme, that Ruth would go in the direction of Boaz. And so poor Boaz, being the clueless male that he is, he doesn't know what's coming at him. But he has this young woman, Ruth, who attracts his attention. Now, a part of the issue at play is we don't know the backstory of Boaz, why he isn't married, but he's a little long in the tooth. And he wonders, it would seem, would Ruth have any interest in him? Because Ruth could have all sorts of younger men. Why would she want to be a part of his life, even though certainly he was fairly wealthy and could provide nicely, but nonetheless. So this is now the side of the story from Boaz's perspective, that he goes, well, but I love this woman. And you have an insight into what a true love looks like. At this point in the story, you don't know if it's going to end up good. And he doesn't know if it's going to end up good. But that doesn't change his mind. Regardless of whenever or if ever Ruth will return those feelings of love, he's going to make sure she's well taken care of. So she gets lots of grain. She gets protected. And one evening, Boaz invites her to dinner, along with the workers, but there are no other widows that are invited. So clearly some things are up here. Ruth gets home that evening, and Naomi says, well, you've been out late tonight. What's up? And Ruth goes, well, it was so great. Boaz, he's such a fine man. And he invited me out to dinner even. He gave me a whole bunch of extra grain to make sure that we were well taken care of. And I think he kind of likes me. Okay. Only now does Naomi reveal to Ruth what the scheme has been. She said, well, I actually know Boaz. Boaz is a relative of mine. And the second part of our culture that can be helpful here is that it's understood that if a man dies, it is up to the family system then. They can be held accountable to marry that widow so that the name, the lineage, and the land continues within that family. So we can hold Boaz accountable. Ruth says, you mean he could marry me? Well, yes, absolutely. So Naomi says, go get gussied up. When the harvesting is at its key moment, the farm owners will pretty much just stay overnight where the grain is being taken care of, and then they'll be there right in the morning. So they knew this, and Naomi says, go and propose to Boaz. And so she does. And to recognize, obviously, is there attraction here? It goes both ways. That's good, that's obvious, that's necessary, that's something to be celebrated, but it isn't in any way the entirety of what true love is, that it goes way beyond that. And both Boaz and Ruth understand this, and that's what makes this true love and what makes it something so far beyond what we often settle for. So Ruth says to Boaz, in essence, for a man, in our culture, there's really nothing more important than having a child, particularly a son. To have that lineage to go on, to be convinced that there's something beyond me, and we feel very keenly about ancestry and genealogy, and that, in a sense, we're immortal in that way, that we're confident that good people are beyond us. And you don't have that currently, Boaz, but I can offer that for you. And in return, in this marriage contract, Boaz can provide not only for Ruth, but for Naomi as well. He understands this, and he's absolutely fine with that Naomi's a part of this package. By now, he's finally beginning to understand what Naomi's been up to all along here. That's fine. And he says, yeah, I can provide food, clothing, and shelter for you. I can bring you out of poverty, place my covering over both of you. And I want to do that. That's really where we pick up the story now with the 4th chapter. Because Boaz says, well, but there is one problem. There's a kinsman who is closer to you than I am, and probably younger, and he would have first dibs. Now here's where you have to cherish and notice the conversation, a man to a man. Testosterone shows up here in a significant manner. Because if Boaz was going to be fully transparent, he just tells this next of kin, when he brings the town together, the elders of the community, and so everyone's a witness, he'd just say, hey, our relative Naomi is back from Moab, and she brought the Moabite woman Ruth with her, who's her daughter-in-law, and so they're both widows, and so there's the prospect for you. You have the right to it, if you want to redeem it, as they called it, to have Ruth in the land. He didn't say that. So he's making an assumption, again, about what he knows, certainly from whatever relationship he had with his next of kin, how that person might react. And this is a precious story in that regard. So he's scheming now. He goes, Naomi's not the only one who can scheme. I can too. All right. Because I want Ruth for me. All right. So he says, hey, next of kin dude, you know Naomi. She's our relative, and she's back now from Moab. And she has some land. Would you like that land? Because you have first rights to it. If you don't take it, then I'll take it. But you have first rights, so you just say it. And if you want to have that land, that's great. You can have that land. And the guy goes, absolutely, I really want that land. Thanks, good old Boaz. And then Boaz pauses and he goes, oh, yeah, I kind of forgot to mention that, Ruth, the Moabite woman, the daughter-in-law, came back with Naomi too, and she comes with the package. So you got to marry Ruth and take care of her. And the next of kin goes, no way. He wants the land, but when the woman comes with it, forget it. There's a real powerful, funny story there that's akin to that video. Maybe he watched the video and, thought, I'm going to just stay a bachelor. I don't know. Whatever that was, Boaz knew or could definitely predict what the next of kin was going to say, and so he set him up. And now Boaz and Ruth get married, and as you notice at the end of the book, it talks about how vital it was, not the least of which for Naomi herself, who comes and nurses this baby, and the women of the culture basically say it's her baby. She's grandma, but this continues the lineage. It keeps the name going. And of all things, his name's Obed. He's going to be on a lineage to David, the most important king of Israel, which puts him as in the lineage of no less than Jesus. And you think about all the different machinations that happened in this story, all the different ways that people, yes, even schemed, the little ways in which Ruth, sets herself up so that Boaz is going to be attracted to her, all these different kinds of little pieces of the story that we know as we work with one another, as we have relationships with each other, that it's always different depending on who the other person is, who we are, what our roles in life look like, whether we're male, whether we're female, all those things that enter into play. And so for us to think about, in the story there really seem to be two major commitments that happen. The one I call the major subplot is Boaz to Ruth. That there is a marriage story in this book, but it isn't deemed the most important relationship offering. That happens again with the words of Ruth to Naomi. But this is important, and to recognize, just walk with and be Boaz for a moment. You get attracted to this woman. She's a lot younger than you. I don't know, she seems to kind of like me, but, maybe it's just my imagination, my hopes and dreams and whatever, and I'm just foolish old man. But, it doesn't matter. If she never returns my love, I'm going to make sure that she and Naomi are well taken care of. I will not allow them to go through poverty. I'll make sure they have all the grain that they could possibly desire to eat. So he makes a choice. And he says, I'm going to bring benefit to Ruth's life. Whether there's any ultimate mutuality, whether there's any ultimate commitment, this is who I am. And now, there will of course be that mutuality. Ruth will give him a son. And they will say that this isn't just, a short-term kind of superficial relationship where we just linger with this attraction. This has big kind of substance to it, and they couldn't possibly know at that point, but it has eternal impact in how it ultimately leads to Jesus of all things. But the major plot is Ruth with her mother-in-law Naomi. Because Ruth makes a very difficult decision that at that point in time looks like it's going to be for a life of poverty. Put yourself in her place. To be so committed to another person in your life that you will go along with that person into poverty because you can't stand the thought of that person going into poverty alone. You have that kind of love. You make that choice and you have that driving force that says, I'm going to come alongside of her. I'm going to bless her in whatever way I can, and whatever the future holds, so be it. Now, of course, it looks like Naomi doesn't have anything to offer back in this relationship. She's a poor old widow. What could she offer? Well, she's been around long enough to understand men. That was very helpful. And the little scheming that she does to make sure that Boaz notices Ruth and gets this whole thing going. So that was her mutuality that ultimately comes back into play. And this incredible commitment that, according to Ruth, goes beyond death. So you have these four pieces that I think show up in a true love kind of relationship. And again, to make absolutely sure, obviously, hopefully, this is a part of if you happen to be married, but it's in all those kinds of relationships. They look different, obviously, but these pieces show up. That you have a choice. You make a decision of whether you're going to pursue the possibility of a relationship with a person. We obviously are very careful about how we do this. We don't just throw that out there. We have kind of a certain number of people who are close to us, a certain number of friends, whatever, that get close to us, that come into our lives. So you make that decision. And when you do, you know that there are going to be some bumps for this. But that your only driving force is, how can I bless that person? It's not what's in it for me. It's how can I help that person to find whoever God wants them to be. Now, the kicker, and the part you can't control, is that to really find true love, unfortunately, it has to be mutual. There has to be an intention that goes both ways. So you don't look for that, you don't count on that, but it's not true love unless that exists, that the other person needs to feel as keenly about blessing you as you feel about blessing them. And that it isn't just for the moment, as delightful as a moment might be, but this is bigger than that. It has a lot more ramification than just momentary pleasure, delight. This is about the big picture that says we're committing to a life, to a long term of wherever God takes this. Those four things. And so I invite you to think about in your own life those relationships. You know, they are many and varied. Some might be married. We all have some sense of family. You might have workplace relationships. You might be in school and have those kinds of relationships. And family is always an interesting one because of all the dynamics that might happen there, and has a lot to do with what the type of family system is, and again, whether it's male or female, all those ways. And just the the people that in daily life we encounter, all those ways. And for you to step back and think, all right, what are those relationships in my life? What are the good ones? Hopefully you can grab a hold of some good ones and say, I really cherish these, and I'm going to lay claim to those for the long term, and lift those up and give God some thanks for blessing me in that way. And maybe there are some relationships that hold promise at this point in time. And maybe you need a couple of tweaks, and that you can consider what that might look like to get those to where they really are evidence of true love. And maybe there are some relationships that just don't work out. And it may not even really be anyone's fault per se, but you don't have that kind of mutual beneficial commitment that comes together. And to just kind of let them go away. That for me is how God moves in and among us, that he sets us up. He hardwires us for community. You can't get away from that. And as much as people really try, particularly in recent decades, to run away from it and say, my relationship's just about me and God, you got nothing to offer to it, and you got nothing to say, no input, that's just clearly wrong. That we have all of these kinds of instances of the Bible, where two or more are gathered in my name, all these kinds of things. And you've got the wonderful story of Adam and Eve. Boy, that's a whole other one, where Adam gets to see all the good animals and says, yep, love the cow, love the sheep, whatever, but the cow just doesn't cuddle well. I don't know. And God says, well, okay, I can figure that out. And so Eve comes along, and Adam goes, now that is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Yes, God, you finally figured it out. All right. All those ways in which God is always about relationships. Relationships among his people, relationships with God, that pursuit of unity, that pursuit of peace, that sense where everything is as it should be. These relationships represent true love, and they are passionate. There is that mutually beneficial commitment that happens in these relationships. So as you move about in the world, as you anticipate who you might encounter this week ahead, how can you approach them, avoiding the temptation to say, what's in it for me? And rather say, how can I bring blessings? How can I bless this other person? And in that, how can I move in the midst of a culture that often really says it's all about what's in it for me, to say, no, a better relationship is found from this godly kind of understanding that it's about benefiting one another. And how can each one of us move in our culture to say God offers a better way for developing relationships? That opportunity to bless one another ultimately becomes, of all things, the best blessing of all. And that's the delight of the story of Ruth. I really appreciate that book is in the Bible, because there are so many nuances. It is so real in the kind of ways of scheming and of working with even hormones and things like this that all enter into it. It's real. And so it is in our day-to-day lives, taking into account who are the people that are around us, what drives them, and how can I move in the midst of their lives so that I bless them and that their lives, as a result, are drawn ever closer to the way God would have them to be. Let's pray.